Greetings, everyone. So for today's discussion, we have Dr. Utsa Mukherjee, who will be sharing his reflections on conducting digital ethnography. Utsa is an ESRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southampton and the book review co-editor for the journal Children and Society. He holds a PhD in sociology from Royal Holloway, University of London, and his research focuses on the intersection of race and class within the leisure geographies of racialized middle-class families. He's currently working on his first monograph, Race, Class, Parenting and Children's Leisure for the Bristol University Press. Thank you very much, Utsa, for taking the time to join us today for this very timely and important discussion on digital ethnography. And I guess we'll just start right away. So if you would like to share a bit about your project for which you conducted digital ethnography, so we have an idea of what you did and where you did digital ethnography, that would be really interesting.
Great. No, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and to be sharing my experiences with you. In terms of the project that I did, so the project really grew out of my general interest in the kind of leisure lives of Indian diasporic families in the UK. And especially for diasporic groups in the UK, often those informal kind of community leisure spaces, religious festivals, social events are really at the center of how community life functions in that context, how diasporic people can come together, especially in a context where they're often racialized and marginalized in mainstream spaces. These kind of ethnic leisure spaces, religious institutions become that kind of refuge for them to build solidarity, to really come together and feel part of a community, that sense of belonging. So Durga Puja is one of the biggest kind of festival for Hindu Bengalis from both West Bengal in India as well as from Bangladesh, who are now in the UK. And in the last 3 to 4 decades, a number of such Durga Puja organizing associations have been kind of formed in the UK, from Scotland to kind of Bournemouth, from Wales to Belfast and Cambridge. There's scores of such Durga Puja organizing committees everywhere in the UK now. And they're mostly run by middle-class professional Bengalis, mostly from West Bengal, but also some people from Bangladesh. And in most organizations, it's either West Bengalis doing it, and there are a few Bangladeshis, Hindus organizing it. And in a few others, there's a mix of both. So, but those Durga Puja community events, which happen over 5 days, usually in community halls or church halls or some sort of community locations, can no longer happen because of COVID restrictions. Those in-person gatherings can no longer take place. So I was really interested to know how they're really tackling this problem. So what I found was that they were staging kind of very small scale sort of ritual worships and then live streaming it for their members all over the UK, mostly for free through their Facebook group, through YouTube channels, and so forth. So in terms of going about the project, I observed those live streams of around 20 to 22 Durga Pujas all across Britain. So in Scotland, and one in Wales and mostly in England. And then I followed it up with telephonic interviews with the organizers. So I interviewed around 22 organizers.
Thank you, Utsa. Yeah, this sounds really interesting. And I was wondering if the live streams that you mentioned that you observed, the Durga Puja ones, were these, so these were live, right? So were there any security related issues? So you were watching them on Zoom or YouTube and so on, wherever they were live streamed. But what were the security issues? Because I'm just thinking of all the ethical committee guidelines and everything and how that functions in a digital medium.
Yeah, so there are sort of two parts of that question, really. So one is about the kind of the if you like, the status of those video feeds. So they were public and they were publicly available through the website of the organization or on public Facebook pages of those groups. So for almost all of them, they were kind of publicly available. Even so, mostly I did not ask for Zoom links, but I wanted to look at it from the public angle. So what was publicly available, right? So if they were doing it on YouTube, it was open for anybody to watch.
Yeah. But what I'm hearing is that for the purpose of observing the pujo itself, it was everything that was made public was what you observed. So there wasn't really any challenge to access ethically.
Exactly. So if, for example, if I had to do a similar uh, kind of research in previous years when they were not kind of put online or on Facebook, I have to actually individually visit those pujos and spend time to see the worship and so forth.
Yeah.
But now it was possible to, even, for example, often the pujos happen on the same day, right, for most organizations. So with this kind of recordings, you can actually go back and watch later. You can even now go and watch now if you like. Most of the pujos are available online. So yeah, so it created new opportunities, often unforeseen ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's really fantastic, because I remember how many pujo pandals happen simultaneously. So it's so as a researcher who's doing ethnography on the field, it's not always possible to go through all the pujos on the same day. But I was, as you were saying, I was just thinking, how did you feel about doing this online? So about the whole issue of not just confidentiality, because it was public anyway, so there wasn't any issue of access, but at the same time, how did you feel about doing this digitally? So since it wasn't in person, so there was an opportunity, yes, but do you think there was something that you felt was constrained or hidden, or something that you felt was constraining you from doing the kind of ethnography you are used to doing?
Often with this digital ethnography, people often look at kind of, say, for example, going to the place where it's being recorded or the video is being produced and looking at that aspect of it, which of course I did not have access to. So, and especially given the pandemic, where sort of I also had to go by what was possible for me, what the university would allow for me to do, and so on. So even if I could travel, it wasn't right for me to travel and have a look at what people were doing. So it's also about how I was framing my aims and my questions, if you like. So if I really wanted to see how those sort of religious symbolisms and messages are encoded in the staging of the virtual aspect of the pujo, that is, I think, an important thing to know in itself, right? If I wanted to understand the labor behind putting up the kind of online pujo, and who was doing what and how that was happening on the ground, then that would be a different set of questions, and that would require me to be there on the ground to see how that was happening. Because my aim was to understand that what happens when pujo is live streamed. How are people what comments are people putting? How are people engaging? How even is the priest engaging with the camera, right? But yes, but definitely this kind of organization of Durga Pujo really helps reproduce caste hierarchies. So that is why I was, and also another thing I must say in terms of I think it kind of colors the methodology as well, because I am not a practicing Hindu, right? Even if I am Bengali, and yes, I grew up in a Hindu household. I am non-religious. And therefore, that also gave me a certain kind of step back to see that kind of gendered and caste dimensions. So people who'd otherwise identify as people who do not believe in caste system, or kind of they're very middle-class professionals with kind of anti-caste attitudes. But come pujo, you have to have a Brahmin man do the pujo.
But it's interesting how you how you mentioned the importance of framing of the question while doing digital ethnography, because while it provides you with so many opportunities, I guess what I'm hearing is that you were able to see those opportunities because of the way you framed your question in the first place. So could you share a little bit more about the framing of questions and your research aims while doing digital ethnography, like any advice you have for people looking to do digital ethnography?
I think there are two ways of doing digital ethnography in this sense, because there's one which is, say, for example, you had a plan of doing something in person, you can't do it, and now you're doing a digitalized ethnography of sorts as a kind of compensation for it, right? This can be one way of doing it.
Yeah.
But mine grew out of a need to understand what was going on during the pandemic. So it was really about understanding digital Durga Puja through digital ethnography. I think it is what you are trying to understand has a lot to do with your methods, right? Yeah. And that's true for sort of regular ethnography as well, or regular research methods as well.
Yeah.
So because I wasn't kind of fitting my method, I wasn't fitting my methods to suit kind of the change in the conditions of possibility. I think I just had a kind of, I was just lucky that that wasn't the case. But I appreciate for a lot of other people, it's just something that the next best thing.
Yeah.
And the only thing for them to get their field work done.
Yeah, because a lot of people who have had to, and this was going to be my next question to you, because a lot of people who have had to change their methodology because, you know, they couldn't go physically on the field and they had to do it digitally. It has been really tough. But do you feel that there is some level of staging involved when you watch videos and make analysis out of it? Do you fear that there might be some staging because this is a controlled medium?
So I think there are two things. One is that if there's a staged element, then that is interesting in itself, right? And for example, even if you're sort of interviewing somebody, even kind of in situ, if you like, in their own environment, there's no guarantee that they're telling you the truth.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
So as social researchers, we have to, because I sort of look at kind of my interview data in a kind of in a narrative way. So I see it as a kind of a co-production, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, meaning is always kind of dialogically created in that interview space. So there is no one truth, but it's about how people are kind of storing their experience, how they're creating, and that narrative kind of approach sort of takes away those issues around whether you're looking for truth or not. So it's about that kind of epistemological approach that you have, right? But also in terms of the staged element, I think in my case, because my background has been in cultural studies, so my university degree was actually in English literature. So I had a kind of background in, say, literature and films. And therefore, when I was watching videos and so forth, it was not only about methodological training in social research, but also that cultural studies training, right? The cultural studies debates around how you encode and decode, say, meanings in visual texts.
Yeah.
And digital ethnography at the very outset is really a coming together of those ethnographic methods and media studies and cultural studies methods, right? You cannot look at it solely through the lens of, say, classical ethnography or kind of more conventional social research. You have to kind of accommodate those ideas of cultural studies and media studies around sort of production of visual text, circulation of visual text, and consumption of visual text.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that kind of gave me another kind of sense of not comfort, but it sort of gave me a perspective into this that wasn't just about trying to unpack the truth, but also about understanding exactly how those codifications were happening, what was being staged, how, why, right? And questions of, as I said, I was very aware of the classed, gendered, and caste-based inequalities in those spaces, right? So these were affluent people. These were middle-class professionals who had digital technologies, who had a lot more flexibility in managing their own time to do this, right? And they were catering to a equally kind of middle-class audience.
Yeah.
Those kind of elements were encoded in the way they were staging everything, right? The sense of aesthetics as well. So, yeah.
That's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned interviews, and I remember you mentioned it when we began this conversation as well. And I was wondering, what was your decision-making process like to have interviews along with an ethnography of visual mediums. And I just want to understand your thought process here, because to just see if interviews were necessary to your answering your research question, or was it something that you felt you really needed to validate your results from what you were seeing and what was being shown to you online?
Because I was really interested in understanding what went behind the scenes as well,
Yeah.
or how, because when I really sort of did the interview, I found out a lot of things that I saw were often kind of not exactly planned in the same way. So I'll give you a few examples. There was one case where I saw, if you watch the video feed,
Yeah.
about somebody performing a puja in a living room. The sofa is pushed to one side. Children are trying to light lamps, and they're sort of trying to adjust the camera. The camera is kind of going on its head, and there's that kind of going on, and they're sort of doing their mantras, explaining in English, and so on.
Yeah.
But when I actually had the telephone interview with the organizer, I found out that the puja wasn't supposed to take place in that living room. It was supposed to take place in the living room of the priest. But the day before the puja, I think 24 hours before the puja, the priest's son's school sent a letter saying one of the children in the school has got COVID. So the entire year group has to kind of self-isolate.
Yeah.
And therefore, the priest's entire family has to self-isolate, and nobody can go in and come out. So nobody can bring in the supplies for the puja.
Yeah.
So within like 10, 20 hours before the start of the puja, they had to relocate the entire puja to the organizer's living room. And the priest had to stay in the organizer's kind of house. So again, those were things that weren't accessible readily through the visual feed alone. So I had to listen to the narratives that kind of underpin that visual feed of the.
You were saying that you were interviewing the organizers, right? So were there any issues of access and building trust, because you couldn't like meet them physically? So I assume it was all through phone calls or video call or anything. So what were the moments of discomfort, if I may, or related to any power relations that you felt while accessing, or in just in terms of building trust?
I think a lot of that also depends. So of course, it depends on who you are and who you are interviewing, but it also depends on the topic you were dealing with, right? So if for my PhD work, which is about children's everyday leisure cultures within British Indian families, even if I was Indian myself, or I am Indian myself, the fact that I was asking for them to give me access to their children, right, as an adult male stranger, that was, I think, a bigger problem in negotiating access. So I really struggled sort of getting people to participate in that study. But and that was in person. I would go around, and it sets up all sorts of alarm bells, right, around kind of a adult man coming to your house and talking to your children one to one. It's just so that was a lot more difficult to negotiate. And it was about building trust with those parents first. You interview the parents first, when they get to know you a bit more, and then giving you that opportunity to speak to the child, right? But with this one, it was relatively easier to gain access because it was all virtual. So people were kind of used to not having face-to-face conversations and so forth. So say that I wanted to have this interview remotely, and that was okay. And also the topic itself, because it was less of a sensitive topic in that way.
So you weren't talking to children, right? So
I wasn't talking to children first, and I wasn't talking about children either. Right? It was about, and people. And also the fact that I am Bengali, right? So you would switch between English and Bengali in the interviews as well. So that gave, and again, I cannot skirt around the class and caste issues here, right? Because they were seeing them as one of them with a very similar trajectory, right? So all the organizers, all of them had come from Kolkata to the UK, either as PhD students. There were quite a few academics actually, academics, doctors, engineers, and business executives and IT people. And they saw me as somebody from a very similar kind of trajectory, as a kind of a middle class, upper caste man, who
Yeah.
has come to the UK as a PhD student. So there was that sense of identification. And they
Yeah.
would often say, oh, as you know, this happens. Or, oh,
Mm.
as you know, that happens.
Yeah.
And then they would elaborate,
So there
right?
was a
So
sense of belonging already in place that helped you build the trust.
exactly. So I didn't have to work much towards that.
I was also wondering, like, taking the whole idea of digital ethnography on a seeing it in a bigger picture kind of a way, and because in a lot of our conversations we discuss what didn't work, or what were the failures, or what were the hesitations, or what were the moments of discomfort, personally, if people want to share, or even professionally. So I was wondering if you could share some of that as well.
Yes. So to begin with, I was saying that because so many events were happening in a very short span of time, and you cannot give time to all of it, right? So you might have to like come and catch up later.
Mm.
So that was a challenge to begin with, right? So how do you choose? Who do you approach?
Mm.
And then about even kind of arranging time and with the organizers. So
Mm.
that was because they were busy people and you have to like be flexible. And I was interviewing people on Sunday evenings and Saturday afternoons and so forth,
Yeah.
right? So that kind of flexibility, and I appreciate that that's not possible for everybody, for every researcher to have that kind of flexibility on their part.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky that I do. So that I think is another sort of challenge, that you have to give a lot of leeway to the participant to decide on the time that they would like.
Be available.
Exactly. And then kind of accommodate that, accommodate their preferences,
Yeah.
right? But also in terms of sort of some of those thorny issues around caste and so forth. You cannot really just approach them directly. You cannot ask them, oh, why do you do that? So you have to kind of find ways of soliciting those answers,
Yeah.
right? So there's a lot of people where, again, as I'm saying, that they're kind of very middle class professionals who function in a certain kind of professional environment. So
Yeah.
they're very adept at using the language of diversity and inclusion. So they'll talk about, oh, we're very inclusive. There are Muslim Bengalis who come and join us. We have women who do some of the rituals, that the first bathing ritual of the plants, which often are done by male priests, but our women do it. So they would selectively kind of highlight those questions of inclusion.
Ah.
But as long as the actual act of worship is done by a Brahmin priest, then that is kind of out of bounds, right? So it's also interesting to find out what sort of things that they found easier to accommodate and be inclusive about, and what not.
Like selective inclusion in a way. It's interesting how the digital medium can really give you all of that perspective. Just to go back to the interviews, and I will just finish this soon, because I think it's already really long, but it's so interesting to really relate, but at the same time have these new insights, because I'm not an insider to the Durga Puja itself. But I was wondering, for interviews, how did you ensure the security of data? So did you do it, was it a video call, was it an audio call, and what were the security issues related to storing and recording of those conversations?
It wasn't like hugely different from, say, how you would record a regular kind of interview in person. So
Mm.
I, of course, went through a consent form online, in the sense that I asked them whether they're happy to be recorded, that they have the right to withdraw from the study at any point, that I'll be anonymizing the data and not using their names, and so on. So there was a kind of a format that the university had put
Yeah.
for doing fieldwork during the pandemic. So I went through that verbal consent process.
Yeah.
Then I was using my telephone to do the interview, like my mobile to do the interview, and on speaker.
Mhm.
And I was using my laptop to record the voice. So using the voice recorder of the laptop to do it, because I wasn't comfortable using some of those call recording softwares where you do not know where the data is going, or
Yeah.
it's not legitimate. A lot of them are like quite and most of the free ones are not
Yeah.
reliable. So
Yeah.
I used ones, that's why everything was in my own kind of device. And then I was using my university's cloud storage to store the data.
Yeah, this is a very important point about recording, and this is a really nice idea to record it on a personal device. I never thought about it and always wondered how that worked, because there is so much data stealing and theft happening around that. And especially as academic researchers, you are bound by so many ethical guidelines that it often gets tricky as to how to overcome that.
And speaking of ethics, actually, what was again quite interesting in this experience is that, again, for my PhD research, which was in another university, it took me months to get the ethical approval. And of course, because it involved children, so I had to do a disclosure and burying service clearance, that I did not have any criminal records and so forth. But even with that, it took months to get the approval.
Yeah.
But this time, the university had put in place a system where any COVID-related project was getting sort of fast-tracked for ethical approval. So I got ethical approval in a day or two.
Wow.
Which was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And again, those are those kind of positives that kind of emerged from this project, which I'm really pleased about. So that made sure that I was not held back by the ethical process.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing these reflections, and also for making this whole discussion so positive and encouraging, because I'm sure that whoever is hearing this and contemplating doing a digital ethnography would really be encouraged in a way, but also know what the challenges are. And I know that you mentioned how it cannot always be used. For example, if you're working with really marginalized communities who have no internet connection, for example, then how is one supposed to do an ethnography of a space or an event? And so there are some visible challenges. In conclusion, would you like to share some advice or some tips for people who would listen to your interview? Anything that you feel has not been talked about so far?
So again, as I said, it really depends on what you're trying to find out. And why you're trying to find out, and that kind of would shape things. But again, being resourceful is really important. This project wasn't a pre-plan, because I couldn't plan it 6 months in advance. I didn't know that the pandemic would hit in that way, or all this would happen. So just being kind of that sense of flexibility, right? So I had some funding from ESRC to use on research, and I could do a certain percentage of time I could devote to new, fresh research during my postdoc. And because of the pandemic, all the kind of conference, travel, and all of that went out of the window.
Yes.
So the ESRC was quite flexible, that you can then redirect some of that time to doing something else. So it's really, this entire kind of online pujos really intrigued me. I was seeing that they were trying to stage online pujos. And I just sort of, you turned it into an opportunity to do this project. And not that anybody asked me to do it, or that it was part of a bigger plan. It's just something that interested me, and I had the opportunity and the resources to draw on. So I just went for it. So being that kind of resourceful and flexible, and as I was saying, with this kind of online interviews and so forth, much like in-person interviews, you have to be flexible and work according to the convenience of the participant, right? Really put the participant at the heart of it, what their time preferences are, how there were doctors who were on like calls in the evening. So if something happened in their hospital or whatever, they might get called. So they would tell me that, well, if a call comes in, I might have to take it. I said, of course you have to, and that's fine, and whatever. So making those kind of accommodations was really important. So being resourceful, and of course, seeing the positive in things, in the sense that what can I do given everything, right? Because especially for the last 1 year or so, there wasn't a lot you could do over and beyond the restrictions, right? You couldn't travel, you couldn't do a lot of things. And then of course means that we are losing out on capturing and giving voices to a lot of really people who are actually struggling because of the pandemic. And this festivals and this middle class leisure spaces are all very good, but these are not the people who are actually sort of suffering on the front lines of the pandemic, right? And it has really kind of blunt the kind of sharp edges of social research in terms of harnessing those voices of marginalized groups.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think there are other opportunities to be had in terms of thinking more creatively about what can be done, right? So even in terms of, say, media coverage of certain groups,
Yeah.
or other such things where you can get an indirect view of their
Without
of the,
actually having personal access.
yes.
Mm.
And then yes, so it's and I completely appreciate. I don't know what I would have done had my PhD fieldwork been in this period.
Mm.
So, I'm in a lot privileged position that my PhD and the entire PhD examination, everything got over just weeks before the pandemic started. So that's a privilege for me that I didn't have to go through it. But I guess that's the thing, because you can only kind of extend your PhD sort of study till a certain point, but you have to kind of
get it done.
So
your advice and suggestions and personal reflections have really been very helpful. Thank you so much. Before we conclude this, for whoever is watching this, with the video, you will have a description of Utsa's research and his profile link if you're interested in this discipline, but also a list of suggested resources, both academic and non-academic, with which Utsa has kindly curated with us, which can help you to look at other resources which are out there and hopefully help with your research. Thank you so much, and stay safe and take care.